Welcome, everybody, to this event called Talking Populism. It's organized by the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, and it's co-hosted by me and Alessandro. Just very briefly about us, Alex works in the Department of Communication, and he studies many different things. One of them is populist communication, and that is the thing that is really relevant for today. I myself, I'm Matthijs Rooduijn. I work in the Department of Political Science. I also study populism and also many other things. And I think what we also have in common is that both of us focus on voting behavior and also political psychology perspectives. I think that is what we share. But enough about us. Why we are here is because we have Luca Manucci here as a guest. And he's very special. We have met, I think it is about 8 years ago.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I was in Zurich. You were doing your PhD back then, and that was a kind of a conference about populism. Luca is now a researcher at the University of Lisbon, and he has studied and worked in Italy, Belgium, Switzerland, and Portugal. Now. Yeah. Am I missing something?
I don't know.
No, maybe. That's about it. He is interested in everything that has to do with populism and also particularly collective memories of the authoritarian past. And I think you might want to say a bit more about that later. And I think there are very few scholars with a better overview of the whole field than Luca has. So I think it's really interesting to have him here and to hear from him what he thinks are the most interesting developments and things in the field of populism studies. And we're here in particular because he has published this book, The Populism Interviews, a dialogue with leading experts. And it's a collection of interviews with experts in the field, and I think it's really interesting because it's a huge variety of different kinds of experts, older, younger, with different methodological perspectives, different substantive perspectives, people who are very experienced, people who are less experienced, and therefore it is a very colorful, accessible and very informative book as well. And I think what makes it very interesting is that it's really informative for experts, for scholars of populism, but also for people who are interested in populism but do not have all the knowledge that you need to have to read the very specific and technical articles about populism. So I think it's really informative and accessible. And the way in which it's written, it's interviews, I think that really helps to... it's almost a page-turner, I would say. Much more so, at least, than the regular monographs in the field. Tonight, Luca will briefly introduce the book in about 10 minutes or so. And then we will have a conversation about it. We will ask Luca some questions about it, both Alex and I. But Luca will also ask us some questions because we have both contributed one of the chapters. And then, of course, we will also have enough time to open up the floor for discussion and listen to any comments or questions you might have. So I think that that's it. Let's get started, Luca. The floor is yours.
Do you hear me, or do I need a microphone?
You need a mic for the recording.
I do need a microphone for the recording. That sounds good. All right. If I do this, oh yeah. So there we go. As Matthijs said, we are here because just came out this weird book, which is a strange project. To understand this book, we have to go back to 2013. Shortly after, Matthijs came to Zurich, where I was doing my PhD, and he told us a lot of interesting stuff about populism, and there I decided, oh yeah, this is cool. This is something that it's interesting. Well, honestly, it was a part of that. It was definitely a part of that, because I saw you following the steps of Casmude, and trying to establish whether or not there is this famous populist zeitgeist. And so it's 2013, Switzerland, I'm doing my PhD, and populism at the time is like important, but not yet what had to become a few years later. But I find it really fascinating. For example, why Berlusconi, Wilders, Trump, and all these guys have this crazy haircut? What is with populist guys? Why do they look so weird? Then came the crisis, and it came the fight between Varoufakis and the Troika, the opposition between the left populists and the right-wing populists. Then came left-wing populism in Greece and Spain, and Brexit, Boris Johnson, another guy with really weird hair, and I keep wondering, what is this populism thing? Why? I really think it's interesting. We should know more about it. But doing my PhD, my main job was to collect data, form the coders, write the code book, you know, scientific, a bit dry stuff. And then quickly I also learned that in academia, academia is just a constant process of horrifying rejection, where you submit papers and then they get rejected, and then again and again until it finally works. And I thought, okay, I can do that, but at the same time, when something happens, I need to be able to talk about it, to discuss it when it happens, not a year, 2 years, 3 years after, when my paper is published and nobody cares about it anymore. So one day at lunch, a friend of mine asked me, yeah, why don't you do a blog? Why don't you do a blog on populism? And I told him, that's a super stupid idea, dude. Why would I ever do that? 6 months later, I created my blog on populism, which is called POP, Political Observer on Populism, exactly for this purpose, for finding an outlet where to discuss issues that I found interesting and that I didn't want to write an article for an academic journal about. So what happens is that as every PhD student, I start reading and reading and reading and reading, and you're responsible for at least 50 articles, so don't look at me like that. You were part of the reason why I was reading so much. No, but like everybody, you know, you do your literature review. You try to figure out what has been said and what else you can add to that field of study. And there are certain authors that I start considering like people that I am linked to, although they don't know that, because I keep reading their articles, books, chapters. I like them, I engage with them. And then I start thinking, wait, but I have a blog on populism. Why don't I start asking questions to these big people about what they think, like what they think about now, what's going on right now, not about the article they wrote 10, 20 years ago. So I want to ask questions to the experts. Can you explain, in the light of your research, what's going on with Brexit, what's going on with Donald Trump, what's going on with Bolsonaro, what's going on with a lot of things that are linked to populism? So I start doing interviews. I keep doing interviews. I do them for 6 years, between 15 and 21. And then last year, when was it? In June, I decided that I had enough experience and material to finally put these things in the form of a book. And I already braced myself for the classic academic horrific streak of rejections, of painful and horrifying rejection stories. I sent my proposal to Routledge, the editor, in particular to Craig Foley, who's the responsible for social sciences. And I say, look, Mr. Foley, you know, I have a strange thing to tell you. You know, I do interviews to academics, and I would like to do a book of interviews about populism. And then I click send, and I'm like, oh, this is gonna be so bad. It's gonna, like, they were gonna hate it. They're not gonna even reply. And like 10 minutes later, Craig replies, yeah, sure, I know your blog, let's do it. And I'm like, oh, okay, so yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, why would we not? All right? It's obviously we're gonna do it. Let's do it. So the blog became a book, and I have to say, the experience of these 7 years of doing interviews actually taught me a couple of things that I think are important, because we we tend to publish and get into this mindset of, you know, the CV, the publication. That's completely fine. But at the end of the day, if what we do has no impact, has no connection to society, it's a bit sterile. It's a bit, you know, a dead end. You know, what do you do? Which is one of the reasons why this book exists, the interviews exist, to bring the knowledge of these people out of the ivory tower, at least trying to. And what I learned in these 7 years of having a blog, where there are both interviews and short articles, is that it is possible to convey a complicated message in simple terms, if you try. If you forget for a second your academic jargon, if you forget for a second about these words that set you apart from the people out there, that they don't know these words, and polarization and all these things. And we talk like this, but we forget that most people don't. So it is possible to convey these messages in a simple way. It is possible to do a short post or interview where important issues are discussed, and especially when you do it online, it's great because you can put web links that bring the reader somewhere else. You can use examples that clarify a concept. So we kind of praise ourselves when we are inaccessible and super specialistic, but that's, you know, it works within academia, I think, but then when you get out, it's another word, and if you don't convey your message, it's just dying there and nobody's going to understand that. So yeah, this is how I came to write this book, composed of 30 interviews to 32 experts, because 2 of them are double interviews, and I don't remember what I wrote here. Oh yeah, I wanted to not only have a book of the big names, like the 30 super big names that everybody knows. I wanted also some new, younger scholars that do really interesting research about populism. I wanted actually more interviews, but we had some constraints of space, so, you know, can always publish a second one at a certain point if there is need for. And the book is divided in three sections. The first one is like a historical account, let's say. We discuss with the 10 interviews the history of populism. We go back to the 19th century. We provide definitions. We discuss what it is that we're talking about, where was it born, how did it evolve. Then the second section is more about the causes and consequences of populism. There is, I think especially on this aspect, there is the biggest amount of literature. So what causes the success of populist actors and what are the consequences of this success? And then there is the third section. I mean, you can't really choose among kids, but if I had to, this would be my favorite section, because it's the section where I could put all the interesting stuff that couldn't fit in one clear category. And in a certain way, it's populism beyond politics, beyond elections, beyond parties. One of my favorite interviews in this section is with Melanie Schiller. She discusses how folk music can create national identities and foster right-wing populism in Sweden and Austria. I find all this kind of connection between popular culture and populism extremely interesting and understudied. So yeah, of course we can talk more about the book. You can ask questions. We can debate that afterwards. But I would say that that from my side, that's it. I leave you here the blog, the web link to the blog and to the Twitter account link to it, and I can ask you some questions, and you can ask me some questions if you like. Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Starts. You or we?
You do.
We do.
Thanks. Thanks, Luca, also for introducing the book. I can only confirm what has already been said, that the book is absolutely amazing, and not simply because there is chapters from us, but as an object itself. You really, and you say it also in the preface, right? You strike this sort of sweet spot between going deep into topics, but also offer sort of a fresh account. And my question is actually related to this. In your preface, you say, I'm quoting, hope not misquoting you, you say this book is like a compass, but it's not a map, right? Mm-hmm. So it doesn't help you to sort of necessarily go to the destination, but it helps you navigate a little bit through the waters of populism. Okay. Hence my question to you. I do understand how this book is sort of framed to understand concept from a theoretical perspective and past events. How would you recommend to use this book to understand future events. Like, let's say that someone picks it up and say, oof, there is an election in Brazil coming up. I would like to sort of understand a little bit more. The book is not about Brazil, but to what extent this contributes to reflecting about what comes up.
Should I reply now? That's right. Yeah, thanks. That's a nice but tricky question. So actually, I was reflecting about this. I've presented this book also in 2 other Dutch cities in the last days, and this is kind of how to use the book is a very good question. And while replying to this question, I realized I wrote it for the myself of 2013. I have to admit I didn't realize this until now, but I wrote it for the myself of 10 years ago. And the reason is this. When you approach a topic like populism, which is a macro topic, when you say populism, you talk about so many different things. And having a book like that, organized a little bit by topics and sections like this, I think it's a portal, a starting point. So you are there and you sit in this hall where you can have a look, a panoramic view of all these different things. And this is what I missed, something systematic. When I started this PhD, I was like, okay, there are 950 books, 50,000 articles, 900,000 chapters. Where do I start from? What has been said? So this, for me, is a starting point. It could also be very useful if you already know a lot of things about populism, but I think it is essentially a map to navigate. Not a map, as you said, but a compass, like to give you like a direction. And it might seem stupid, but there is an index at the end of the book. And the index is actually very helpful, because if you want to, so now there are the elections in Brazil. And in my opinion, we didn't prepare this, but
We did not.
Bolsonaro is at page 25, 27, 31, 80, 96, 121, 133. You understood. We talk a lot about Bolsonaro in this book. There is not a specific interview about Bolsonaro. There is not a specific interview about Brazil. But we talk about Bolsonaro a lot. So you can, I mean, there is not written who will win the elections. But otherwise I would be very rich by now. But there are many interesting things about Bolsonaro for sure.
You talk about the book and maybe also the concept as a map or a compass. And I think one thing that we should discuss a little bit from the outset is the concept of populism, to make sure what it is. Well, we can never answer that question, but maybe what some people think it is and what other people doubt that it is. But I think if you look at what I found interesting is that you also, what is really interesting if you read the book is that you get to know the authors of the different chapters a bit, or well, the authors, the people who are interviewed a bit better. And one of the topics that comes back more often is the relationship between populism and fascism. That is discussed relatively often. And I was wondering, maybe you could explain a little bit how populism is defined and also its relationship with fascism according to the different approaches to populism and what your take on that would be.
I put this. Yeah, that's another $1 million question. I put this because so you can see, I think it's interview number 5, yeah, with for the fascist roots of populism with Federico Finkelstein. Federico is a great historian from Argentina. And I find his interview exactly going in this direction because he analyzed how after World War II, in Argentina and in Latin America more in general, fascism, of course, like everywhere else in the world, became taboo, stigmatized. You can't be a fascist. And many politicians from Vargas to Perón kind of used populism to reintroduce a certain idea of democracy that he claims borrowed some elements of fascism. So it's fascism in democratic terms. And I find his approach very, very interesting. At the same time, what is populism? Like, on that regard, interview number 1. Interview number 1 with Benjamin Moffat is there for a good reason. Benjamin Moffat, I think, is the one who clarified that beyond the differences of our definitions and approaches, we all kind of agree on what populism is. I don't know who of you is familiar with this field, but since I started 10 years ago, and probably since you started before me, every paper you write on populism starts with "populism is a contested topic." I hate it. I hate it because everything is contested. Fine, no problem with that. But I think that
we agree a lot.
But we agree a lot, and that's why interview number 1 for me is key in that regard. Benjamin shows, look, you can take the ideational approach, the stylistic approach, the performative approach, but at the end of the day, populism, for all of us working on it, is the opposition between the pure people and the corrupt elite. There are elements that vary, there are different ways of looking at it that vary, but we all kind of agree. Then I think it's true, though, that we disagree on one aspect, which is populism illiberal? Like, is populism a threat for democracy? And from a normative standpoint, of course, it depends what do you mean for democracy and what do you mean for threat. And here there is Cristóbal Rovira Calvásser, another great scholar who was my co-supervisor during the dissertation, who claims exactly this. It depends what do you mean by democracy. If you mean liberal democracy, what we mean by democracy in the West of Europe, then it is a problem because it has illiberal elements. It threatens minorities, rule of law, checks and balances, media freedom. You can see what's going on in Hungary and Poland, probably in Italy soon. So it depends. It depends.
If I can jump in on that, you of course have expertise on populism, but you also come in from the angle of fascism, authoritarianism, and memory, collective memory, right? So even beyond the relationship between fascism and populism, and going back also to my question before, to use it to understand current events, how would you see, from a substantive standpoint or in practice, a link between populism and contemporary authoritarianism? I voluntarily do not equate authoritarianism and fascism, right? So let's think, for instance, the case of Russia. To what extent, in your opinion, as this meta-expert on populism, would you use the populism sort of key to unlock dynamics of what happens today in authoritarian states? And I don't know if there's an answer to that, but I'm very curious to hear what you think about it.
I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. And I don't know if we need an answer, in the sense that what Putin is doing, the war in Ukraine, I don't think it has anything to do with populism at large. But it is true that at the same time, the 20, how many years has he been in power? Yeah, a long time. He's been building this opposition between certain types of Russians and other types of Russian. And if you remember, we said before, populism is this us versus them, the people versus the elite, and the way in which authoritarian leaders use this populist textbook of dividing society plays into a lot of things: nationalism, authoritarianism, even fascism, a lot of ism. And I think it's a trick as old as people to separate. You draw a line. We are here, they are there. And this line, it's not necessarily a problem, but if used in a certain way, it can become a problem. That's why sometimes I say that, in my opinion, populism is sort of like the dark side of democracy.
I like that.
So you can, the Force in Star Wars, you can use it for good or for bad. And same for me is populism. Like, if you use this distinction to actually go against the corrupt elite, because let's make it clear, it's not all a conspiracy theory. There are incompetent elites, there are corrupt elites, and there are good people out there, and building this opposition is not so bad per se, I believe. It becomes bad when from this follows, and then the bad people cannot vote anymore, or the bad people have to be invaded. So I think it's how you manipulate this sentiment, and well, you know much more about me on how to do that, but we will talk about it soon.
I was wondering, do you think we use this concept of populism a lot? We do it, journalists do it, many people do it. There is this argument that this is to some extent problematic, because we use the concept to describe politicians like Marine Le Pen, Donald Trump, Geert Wilders, Viktor Orban, and they are called populist by many people, and that is how we categorize them. However, what these politicians also have in common is that they, what we call, are nativists. So they also are negative towards other groups. Populism is about the relationship between the people versus the elite, as you have said. But nativism is about the nation versus other groups, people of another race, another religion, immigrants. You can think of many different outgroups. That is something that these politicians also have in common. So my question is, by referring to them as populists, aren't we trivializing something that is actually maybe more dangerous in reality?
First of all, thank you for stealing my question to you. On this, there is an amazing interview, well, two. One with Aurélien Mondon, I think number 9. Yeah. And the number 10 with you, actually. We discuss a bit this. So Aurélien Mondon is a researcher who has worked in the last years about what he calls populist hype. And he claims that we lost our mind. We started calling everything populism. This is populist, that's populist, to the point that it kind of lost its meaning. And it's true, if everybody is a populist, then who is not, and why does it still matter? And he looked especially into the role of media in this, because, of course, it's the media who convey information and tell you who is and who is not a populist. And he makes a very solid argument that this is very counterproductive. It's counterproductive, especially when you use the definition of populist to refer to that, to nativism. Like, the fact that I'm against migrants has nothing to do with the fact that I'm populist. I do an example because now there have been Italian elections, and I am Italian, and I'm still traumatized by it. But the fact is that this coalition of 3 right-wing parties has been defined as populist. Well, it is true. These 3 parties, their leaders at least, are all more or less populist. Silvio Berlusconi, moderately populist. Salvini has been quite populist for quite some time. Meloni was not, then was, then is not. I don't know. You know better than me also this, but I don't know if she's a populist. But the point is, it is irrelevant whether these people are populist. These people are neo-fascists and nativists, and that is what we should be talking about. And Aurélien Mondon makes a very good point. If we keep calling them populist and not for what they are, we are making them a favor, we are normalizing their position, and we are making their discourse acceptable. Or anyway, we are creating the enemy, which is the populists is the enemy. But the populists are also Podemos, Syriza, and other parties. So when you call people so different the same name, you're not revealing or explaining, you're obscuring the meaning of things, in my opinion. And I think it's time for me to ask you some questions. Yeah, because I think I start from Matthijs because it's connected to what we were saying now. So you started working on populism before it became, the hype was there. And you worked at one of the nicest and biggest projects on populism in collaboration with The Guardian. It was 2019, if I'm not wrong. You published an impressive series of really good articles from academics. And that's the single most exciting and big project of bringing what populism scholars researched into a broad audience. So I wanted to ask you, how did it start, this experience of collaboration with The Guardian? What is the takeaway? What is the lesson you learned? And if you noticed any of these things we discussed of using populism to refer to other things.
Yeah. So I like that project a lot because they approached me because they were doing a huge project. They wanted to research populism in Europe, basically, and they asked me to work with them and to classify European parties as either populist or not. So I worked together with many scholars in different countries, because I'm not an expert of every country, of course. But so we did this huge project, and in the end, I think what was really, really good about this project are basically two things. So for us as researchers, we were able to communicate our research to a big audience, and that was something that was great, because I don't know, an academic article is on average read by 3.5 people or something, so that's not a lot. But when you publish in The Guardian, of course, you have more readers. So that was I was really happy about. But I also think that it was really good for journalists and media, because they really took a lot of time and put a lot of effort in this research project. So they really paid a lot of attention to the concept. They really made sure that they defined everything in a good way. And it was very substantive pieces. So that's not always the case. Also in quality media, it's not always very good pieces about populism. But I think these pieces were really good. So I think it was a very good collaboration between academics and journalists. And I think it was an example of how things can go really well in such a transdisciplinary approach. What I do think is that the question I asked you, I've also been thinking about that. This project was about populism. But then, in the end, it was also a lot about radical right-wing populism. But these parties were called populist. And that, I think, was exactly the trivialization that I was talking about before. And that's not necessarily the fault of The Guardian or of us, but I think that we should be very aware of this, that yes, we should label parties as populist, but we should use the concept only if we are really interested in the relationship of the people versus the elite. But if we want to describe parties like Le Pen's party, Viktor Orbán's party, parties like that, Donald Trump, then we should not focus, at least not only focus on populism, but also incorporate these other, maybe more, for democracy, more dangerous things that they have in common. So that is something I also learned, that these projects also have important effects on how we talk about things, and that is something that we as academics also should take into account, and that is something that we are not that good at yet, or not aware of often even.
I have something for you. Alessandro is an academic hero of mine. He makes among the most exciting and interesting research on populism out there. I absolutely had to have him in the book. Alessandro researches particular, I would call it the stylistic elements of populism, or so there is the whole literature saying that populism is an idea, an ideology, a worldview, and that's fine, but there is a whole other branch of people thinking to populism more in terms of style. And a lot of people say that populists are these crazy characters who use a simple but also very vulgar language and say things as they are, and have their own crazy style. And I always thought that, yes, it made sense to me, until I saw Alessandro's research showing that basically populists are psychopaths, narcissistic, and Machiavellian. And I'm like, okay, say more words about this. Who are these populist guys? What style do they have? Why are they so crazy?
Thanks. That's a good question. I don't know if I would say that they are crazy for sure, or that I don't think I can say that, but it's true that there is for sure a stylistic component to the study of populism as well. And it's on this type of research that you also see the areas where different scholars of populism don't necessarily agree or fully overlap. Like, for instance, you mentioned Berlusconi is not really a populist. We should not use the populism frame to investigate Trump. I agree with both, if we consider them on a scale of whether or not they are populists, right? But if we change a little bit the frame and we ask, do they behave like one, right? And so we are not more interested in whether they are populist, but we are more interested in terms of the performativity of what populism is, right? So sort of behaving like one. Then there is also almost like a new perspective that opens, which is, of course, overlaps a lot. It's not a secret that those who behave like a populist are the populists. So the two, of course, like overlap quite a bit, but it's not a perfect overlap. And this sort of long and winding introduction is basically to say, even on top of investigating populism as a phenomenon, there is a little bit of research, and Ben Moffitt, that you said at the beginning, is one of the sort of founders of this perspective, that investigate the populist style. So who behaves like a populist? So what is a populist style? You mentioned a couple of elements. Well, the most important one probably is behaving in a very bombastic way. So to put forward a performative style that tries to sort of breach politics as usual. If everyone more or less agrees in terms of definition of populism, that when it comes to rhetoric of political position, there is this opposition between anti-elitism and people-centrism, right? The corrupt elite and the pure people. There is also increasingly a consensus that populists, as political animals, almost behave badly, right? There is this, I'm blanking on the author, but this fantastic metaphor that populists are almost like the drunk uncle that comes at dinner and is already drunk and then misbehaves and he sort of eats a little bit and throws food around and then goes away. And everyone is like, what just happened? That's sort of the metaphor of populism intervening on the political life of the country and sort of shaking up a little bit the house, for bad and for good, of course. Huh? There's the duality of populism. You mentioned one specific component, and then I'm going to shut up about this. The dark side. One of the components of this performative style of populists can be, according to some scholars, understood in terms of dark side of human personality. So without getting into details about personality styles and personality tropes, but it seems that what many populists have in common is to score high on 3 factors of personality, of human personality. First one is psychopathy. It sounds very badly, but it's not like going around with a knife. It's not psychopath. It's simply incapacity of connecting emotionally with other people, right? Psychopathy. The second one is narcissism, and I don't have to provide you examples about classic populist figures that project a bombastic aura, right? I think you can all think of many, including in the Netherlands. And this is, of course, related to what you were saying before about the hairstyle, right? Bombastic projection. And then the third is Machiavellianism, which is the hardest to investigate. I'm going to turn this into a question for you, because, of course, Machiavellianism comes from Machiavelli, great Italian philosopher and political scientist. And basically, what Machiavellianism says is to score high on this trait, you need to understand that you can manipulate the system. Right? This is what being Machiavellian means. So I'm going to turn this into a question to you. Do you believe that populists are Machiavellian in the sense that they have understood the rules of the game and they're there to manipulate them in a very conscious way?
As I said before, conspiracies exist. And then there are conspiracy theories. These are 2 different things. I do not believe that most populist politicians even understand the basic rules. I mean, I don't think Donald Trump knew what he was doing, or Bolsonaro. I think this is one of the reasons why we were all very much more worried when they won than for the 4 or 5 years they were in power. In the sense that, first of all, they operate within a system of checks and balances, so they don't have absolute power. They try to achieve absolute power, but they don't have it yet. And they operate, of course, with free media and civil society. And I do not think they particularly understand the political game or rule, at least not more than non-populists, I would say. That's my impression, but I don't know if that's true. And that could be for good, in the sense that if on top of appealing to the people, on top of winning the elections, they would also be Machiavellian geniuses who can manipulate institutions, we would all very soon live in authoritarian regimes, I would say. And that's a good point, though. I have another question for you, which is, so these are...
About this topic? Yeah? Okay.
No,
I have a related question.
Go on.
Yeah? Because I was... first I wanted to mention one of the studies in this Guardian project, because it's related, where researchers investigated the speeches of Donald Trump and to what extent they were populist. And they found that some of the speeches were really populist and some of them not. I told you, right? We told you populism is about the good people versus the evil elite. So they found that some of these speeches are really populist and some of them not. And the ones that were populist were the ones that were read from the teleprompter. So only those speeches were really populist. So what was the explanation? The speeches that were really populist were written by Steve Bannon, and he was really strategic and made them populist. But when Trump was improvising, he didn't talk about the good people, he only talked about himself. So there was no populism in those speeches, and that was something that was a fantastic finding. Yeah. Now I was wondering, you relatedly, you say that populists basically, to some extent, are successful because they behave in a certain way, and then it turns out to work. But my question is, to what extent are they now learning from each other? Because we know that they are increasingly collaborating at the European level, at international conferences. And for example, we see now, and it's also written a lot, so maybe I'm mistaken, but that Bolsonaro, for instance, is really playing the Trump playbook, right? He's doing exactly the same things, like spreading fake news, raising the impression that the elections are faked, all things like that. So to what extent are they learning from each other, using similar strategies? And that's also related, maybe Alex, you can also say a bit about that. And to what extent is that working? And is there also something that is really a populist strategy?
I will be very brief. If you want to add something on this, go on. I do think they're learning from each other a lot, in the sense that they see what works and they copy it, and that makes sense. For example, before the elections, Giorgia Meloni, the future Prime Minister of Italy, went to Spain, invited by Vox. Vox is another populist radical right party. And if you look at their programs, I mean, they're very similar, especially when it comes to traditional family, no abortion, no gay rights. Recently, I analyzed qualitatively, so reading through very carefully the electoral programs of Vox in Spain and of Chega, another similar party in Portugal. And I found that there are sentences that are identical. Oh, yeah? Identical. So I do believe that these parties are copying each other and looking what works and using it. Another thing I wanted to say is that actually back in the days, Podemos is a left-wing populist party in Spain. Well, those who created Podemos went to learn populism directly in Venezuela from those who worked for Chavez, the president there, and actually studied all with Ernesto Laclau, a very big populism scholar. So all of these things don't happen by chance. These things, I don't want to say that they always happen with a super sophisticated team that wants to conquer the world and do all of this on purpose, but for sure there is a way of looking at each other and looking at what works. The last thing I want to say on this, though, is that at the same time, when you look at the European Parliament, they are all grouped, these right-wing populist parties, they're grouped in two European groups. One is the, now I'm blanking on the names, there are two groups where there are all these parties. And it's crazy because at the national level, they say the same exact thing, as I was saying, sometimes using the same sentence, copy-pasted in their program. But then they hate each other because they're nationalists. So if I'm saying the same thing, which is great in Italy, and you're saying that thing, which is great in Switzerland, well, let's not take Switzerland because it's out of the European Parliament, but in Germany, and we all agree, we go and drink a beer, but then it's about my Italian interest and your German interest, and they fight because they don't really coexist. So I think it's really interesting to connect this transnational network of populists who learn from each other and look at each other, and how then this translates in a huge mess when they reach a place where they should cooperate and they struggle to. But if they manage to, I think that we are in danger. You want to add something?
Just briefly on this. The cooperation at the upper level is almost ironic when you think of populist parties, because on the one hand, they push the argument against sort of internationalization, but then try to set up like an international of populism. It's sort of, there is an interesting sort of conundrum there. But it seems to be working on the sort of center-left side of populism, like this Varoufakis initiative, DiEM25, right? I don't know if you know more about this. I would be interested to hear. But to answer the main point, whether or not there is a a consistency, a convergence between populism, populist movements. What seems to be emerging is that there is a set of behaviors that are in character for populists, right? So what we have been witnessing in the past maybe 20 years, 25 years is politics is getting increasingly dark and negative when it comes to usage of incivility, even intolerance, hate speech to a certain extent, political attacks, right, these kind of things during campaign and also outside of campaigns. And it seems that populists tend to use this type of rhetorical strategies a little bit more. So everyone goes negative during election, open any newspaper during any election, even in the Netherlands, and everyone goes negative. Populists a little bit more. And why this is important, and this is potentially scary, we did an analysis for the 2019 election of the European Parliament, and we found that using this incivility and nasty rhetoric is very dangerous for mainstream parties. They lose votes if they do that. Populists, however, they win votes when they do that. So it's not simply negativity is positive or negative. If negativity is in character, and it is for populists, then this seems to be sort of electorally consequential, which sort of speaks, in our opinion, to the need to overlap the different perspectives of populism, not simply who they are, whether Eurosceptic parties are successful or not, but also how do they perform their populism in the public space, I believe.
I wanted to raise an issue with both of you, actually, because before I said that when I started, I realized there was so much on populism, and here we are presenting a book on populism. The irony, the irony of it. But what I wanted to say is this. A lot has been done, a lot has been written. There are now journals entirely dedicated to populism. There are conferences entirely dedicated, research groups, million books, articles come out every day, special issues, etc. So my question for both of you is there still anything interesting to say? And like, what direction do you think we should take? Like, someone who wants to start doing research on populism now, where should they go? In which direction? What kind of, where is the interesting stuff? Where are the gaps, the famous gaps in the literature, if there are any left?
I think that when it comes, I think there are still many interesting things to study. But I also feel that when I read the newspapers, that every 2 years I'm back. I'm telling the same story again to journalists who ask me about populism, because it's always the same. There is one radical right party in one specific European country that party was successful, and then the question is, what is happening to Europe? Where are we going? Is this new? All these questions. What is populism? And every two or so years, this happens always and over and over again, and this is not really interesting because these discussions just repeat themselves. What I think is, I will just mention one topic which I think is really interesting. Something that I've been studying with Gijs over here and some other colleagues. We look at personality traits and the effect of, the question to what extent people with certain personality traits are more likely to vote for populist or for radical right parties. And we do not know very much about that yet. But what we are interested in particular, is to what extent, which circumstances activate those personality traits. Because, of course, personality traits are not very changeable. They are pretty stable over time, whereas success of populist parties, and that changes a lot over time, and changes and is different between countries. So we want to know what this relationship between personality traits and populism looks like. And Alex has already said a little bit about that. One thing that we also find is that people who score high or low on the personality trait of agreeableness, who are more egoistic, who tend to believe in conspiracy theories, they are more likely to vote for populist parties. That is something that we find, and that is pretty consistent when it comes to both left-wing and right-wing populist parties. And I think this focus on personality traits, but in interaction with all kinds of other things like people's economic position, what happens in the news, to what extent people feel threatened, all these things, to what extent they activate certain personality traits and make them consequential for populist support. That is something I am really interested in.
It's a good question. I'm happy that I don't have a PhD student starting right now wanting to work on populism, because I don't know in which direction I would guide them towards. But if I had to say something, I guess something that is still unclear for me is whether populism as a phenomenon, as a performative sort of component of politics, doesn't matter, is a structuring phenomenon, right? Something that is sort of an important component of our era that sort of drives dynamics, or if it's a symptom of something deeper, perhaps. There are phenomena that I already mentioned. For instance, the fact that politics is getting increasingly negative and harsh. The fact that political attacks seems to be rising. It's this because of populism, or both of them stem from something more underlying? Like, is politics getting darker somehow? Are we all, even in Western societies, getting used to a more aggressive way of politics, and populism is simply sort of a symptom of that, an answer to a demand, almost attitudinal demand from the public of having more aggressiveness in politics? I'm not sure that we have the answer at this point, and I don't know what to think about it, to be honest. The advantage of this uncertainty is that we can investigate populism both as a dependent, as an independent variable, so it doubles the type of work that we can do. But it's still something, in my opinion, that I'm not even sure we can answer right now, because probably we lack a little bit the sort of historical framework to understand when populism emerges. Your question, though, was a good one, but also a nasty one, because you robbed me from the question I wanted to wrap up with. I'm still going to ask you the same question. You not only work on populism, but now with this book also you sort of worked with experts on populism, so you become also this meta-expert on populism. So actually, we should ask you this question: like, what is the next cool, sexy, hype thing in populism? Where is the literature going? What do you think?
It's not easy, but something you also mentioned, by the way, in the book is the work of people like Jessica Di Cocco. Basically, the idea is to be able to stop doing what I've been doing and do something smarter, which is what I did during my PhD was to measure populism in newspaper articles and party manifestos. And to do so, so we analyzed hundreds of electoral manifestos, we analyzed thousands of newspaper articles, and to analyze them, I mean that we had to teach to coders, to human beings, many of them, how to detect populism in these texts. I think the new frontier, something that is really fascinating and something that I think should be done systematically and we should invest in, is to do that automatically. So to have tools that allow you to throw to the machine a huge quantity of texts, and the machine will tell you how populist that text is. I think that's one aspect, more methodological, but still interesting. More substantially, though, personally, I'm tired of populism, but at the same time, I'm kind of trapped in this thing, and my attempt to escape from this golden cage is to do a project that I recently won that goes into that. So starts from this to go in a slightly different direction, which is to look at the normalization of populist radical right parties. For example, I'm now in Lisbon, in Portugal, and I'm going to analyze how the populist radical right parties of Spain and Portugal have been completely stigmatized and unsuccessful for 45 years, and how suddenly, all of a sudden in 2019, in both countries, they finally got electoral success. And so this is a funny anecdote. When I went to work in Lisbon, I was a postdoc hired to work in the project that had the following title: "Why there is no populism in Portugal?" ? By the way, during the interview, I told them, I don't know, I think there is populism in Portugal, but if you want to give me the job and come in, it's okay. And as soon as I started the job, the populist radical right came third to the elections. And like, I told you, guys, I told you there is populism. And also it turns out that the two radical left parties, the communist and the more new left bloc party, are also populist. So, yeah, why there is no populism in Portugal, they say. And, well, there's plenty of it. And this actually is another point that I think is interesting. So normally in our field, we look at demand for populism and supply for populism. This means demand is why do people vote for these parties? Why do people want this? And why do parties give it is the supply. So we say that populism is successful when the demand for populism meets the supply. And I think it's by now established, but I think we should do more research on this, that the demand exists everywhere. It's not that Dutch are more populists than Italian or that Hungarians are more populist than Swedish. I think it's really a lot about the supply. And I think it's very interesting to see how a populist radical right party manages to become successful. So in the project I'm going to start next year, I'm looking exactly at this, at how these two radical right populist parties manage to finally become successful. And I will look in particular at two things, which are on the one hand, the role of the media. So we are going to do a content analysis trying to look at how the media portrayed radical right parties in these countries since the transition to democracy in the 70s, to see if something changed. Is it because the media now are more positive towards these parties? Maybe. And the other section will be looking at mainstream parties. So are these populist radical right parties becoming successful now because the mainstream parties did something, moved somewhere, left open a space? For example, in the Iberian case in Spain and Portugal, both leaders of these populist radical right parties, Santiago Abascal, the leader of Vox, and Ventura, the leader of Chega, were both members of the mainstream right-wing party, so mainstream. And both decided that the mainstream right-wing party was not saying things as they are, that we need to change things, and they both saw this space to the right of that and occupied this space. This is not new. Other people did that. But they did not come from the mainstream. They came from extremist or radical organizations. So one thing I would like to understand is whether Leonie de Jong, a colleague of ours from Groningen, calls it a Trojan horse. Basically, you come as a moderate mainstream guy inside the horse, and then come out, oh, yeah, I'm a fascist, surprise. So, you know, maybe this surprise effect could play a role, I don't know, we will look into that. Sorry for using fascist in that way, we have to be rigorous, so it was a joke.
I have maybe one more question before we open up the floor, and the reason is that I cannot not ask this question. You have now been talking about Portugal and about the fact that they have only recently come to terms with populism. But then we also have this other country, Italy. And in the 90s, there was a huge corruption scandal, and then there was this new politician, Silvio Berlusconi, and he challenged the established order. He was a populist, and he became the new prime minister. And at some point, his coalition partner, the Lega, became increasingly populist as well. They together formed governments for a while. And then they were governments, so they were part of the elite. And then we had the Five Star Movement, who challenged them, a populist party, from outside. It worked. The Five Star Movement was in the government. And then we had the Fratelli d'Italia, who challenged the Five Star Movement and the other populists. And now the Fratelli d'Italia is probably going to be in government and is going to deliver the prime minister as well. So this idea of populists, basically, it's mutating populism. It's what two colleagues of ours, Bert-Jan van Beek and André Zaslov, have called it. Why is that? What is happening in Italy, and why is populism there so strong compared to other countries?
I was talking to one of the people you just mentioned, Andrei Zaslove, yesterday, and it's really interesting because I asked him, why the hell did you start studying Lega in the 90s? what did your supervisor tell you? I mean, when I started in 2013, studying populism was already kind of normal. But he's a Dutch guy who goes and studies a very unimportant Italian party, niche party. Well, fast forward a long time, they are super important in Italian politics. Another Italian colleague, Daniele Albertazzi, calls Italy a populist paradise. So my work has led me to conclude, because I asked myself the same question. I would say that Italy, of course, kind of invented fascism exactly 100 years ago. The March on Rome took place on 28th of October 1922, and probably Giorgia Meloni, neo-fascist, will become prime minister 28th of October 2022. And I'm saying this for a reason. It's not just symbolic. It's also a symbol for the fact that, so I've studied 8 European countries in comparison to understand why populism is more successful in some than in others. And I used all the typical things that we look at to understand that. Is economy doing bad? Is democracy not delivering? Is corruption a problem? Etc., etc. And when I looked at all these classic parameters, they could not explain why populism was more successful than in a country than in another country. Then I thought, okay, there must be something else. There must be something that makes Italy a populist paradise, and Germany until 2017 and Portugal until 2019 never had it. And I thought it must be because we in Italy never dealt with our fascist past and still consider acceptable some illiberal ideas that are also part of populism, to go back to interview number 4 with Federico Finkelstein on how populism is a democratic form of fascism. And to my surprise, I ran the analysis adding this variable, which is stigma, and then I find out that stigma explains extremely well why right-wing populism is successful in certain countries and not in others. Going back to the elections, when, again, I also talked to some media for these elections. They called me and asked, oh my God, this is unheard of. This is, I'm like, oh wow. I mean, apart from the fact that, again, look at 100 years ago, so unheard that it already happened. But look at 94. Let's be more realistic. Let's look at 1994. Silvio Berlusconi wins the elections and forms a government with Lega and Alleanza Nazionale, which was a self-declared post-fascist party. Well, actually, no. At the time, they were considering themselves neo-fascist, and when they formed the government with Berlusconi, the leader made a congress and said, from now on, we are no longer neo-fascists, we are post-fascists, because we are beyond fascism. Fascism is in history, and communism is finished, fascism is finished, we are post. I never understood what that means, and many colleagues have wondered what that means too. But it's interesting, 94 and now, because in 94 we had the same 3 parties, kinda, in government, because Fratelli d'Italia is the more fascist re-elaboration of that Alleanza Nazionale that was in 94. What changed is the reconfiguration of internal power. While in 1994 Berlusconi was the deus ex machina, was the big guy maneuvering, putting people, giving positions, etc. Now he's 86, probably demented. He's on TikTok telling jokes. If you're interested, please, if any of you speaks any Italian, just a tiny little bit, go to his TikTok account. He tells jokes. He opened it a few weeks ago. And said, I'm Silvio Berlusconi. You might remember me as the Prime Minister of Italy many times, and now I have a joke. And he goes, and he still rocks the jokes. He's still rocking those jokes. But here I'm getting lost, but this is extremely funny. The other day actually was his birthday, and now he has a 26-year-old girlfriend, and she put a hot air balloon full of heart-shaped balloons that then went all over the sky. And but Berlusconi is still also in this government, right? He took 8% at the elections. Lega is in government, although they lost a lot, and they're also around 8-9%. And Meloni is in this government probably, and they won 26%. So in reality, it's a reconfiguration. This is nothing new. And this goes to what Stefano Bartolini, a famous Italian political scientist, always claimed, that it changes internally who gets how many votes. But at the end of the day, the two blocs, the right and the left, have the same electorate since decades in reality. It only changes to whom of the parties they go. So there is a huge stability in reality. There is always a 38 to 42% of Italians who end up voting for the right. Now we also have an incredibly demented electoral system for which the right, with 42% of the votes, will get a huge majority. Luckily, not the 2/3 majority for which they could have changed the constitution into a presidential system. But I don't know if I answered your question. When you ask me about Italy, I lose track. I lose track of what I'm saying. I told you that. Maybe we can have some questions from the crowd. By the way, thank all of you for being here on a Friday night. That's impressive. Thank you for being here.
So if you have a question, please raise your hand.
Hi, thank you for the interview. I wanted to ask about collective memory. You mentioned at the very beginning, and towards the end you also talked about stigma, which I thought was really interesting. I was wondering more generally, or maybe even in context like Latin America and South Asia, post-colonial countries and countries that have a past with fascism and authoritarianism and also populism. Do you think that collective memory is there a relationship with collective memory and a demand for an authoritarian leader? And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
I thought we collect more now. No, okay. Yeah. Let's do that. Thank you for the question. So when I indeed studied collective memory in Western Europe, I thought that the logic follow-up would have been to explore the same, but in Eastern Europe, to see how the communist legacies have an impact on vote for populist parties. Indeed, I do believe that it would work. I never tested it empirically, but I also do believe that yes, when there are certain communist legacies, there is a very, very strong right-wing populism like Poland and Hungary show. I also think that it would work in Latin America if you look at authoritarian regimes of various types. Normally they're military, but they can be of certain different types. And actually I was thinking about Brazil, because Brazil is interesting. So they had a long dictatorship, around 20 years between the 60s and the 80s. And in theory, many people said that Brazilians stigmatized very much the dictatorship, the military dictatorship, and they call it direita envergonhada, the shameful right. But then Bolsonaro came, and he changed a little bit. So, and also in Germany. So Germany, in my book about collective memory, is the case that I use to show that if you reckon with your past, if you deal with your past, if you admit your guilt and show that this can never happen again, then right-wing populism will not succeed. Luckily, I published the book right before AfD became the third party in Germany, because that would have, changed my plans. But this is just to say that I do believe that collective memories matter for a certain amount of time. And this you see in Portugal and Spain, in my opinion. The other day it was symbolic in Portugal, we had exactly the same amount, so Portugal had 48 years of dictatorship, which then were followed by 48 years and 1 day of democracy, which were celebrated. And I think that after a few decades, this stigma of the past starts to lose its efficacy in keeping down. So it doesn't work forever. And what does this say? This says that if we learn our lessons, some countries never do. Italy never did. Italy in 1946 was already full of right-wing populists, and Germany took, though, 70 years. Spain and Portugal took almost half a century. So I do believe that this effect exists, but that also it starts fading at a certain point. So, yeah. We have, I don't know who's
Hello. I'm not at all an expert on populism, but I'm wondering, how do you determine what is collective memory? Because I am from Germany, and like when the right-wing party got voted into parliament again, they got a lot of votes in the former regions that were occupied by the Soviet Union. So there's like a Western Germany collective memory, but then they also have a very specific Eastern German collective memory. So how do you determine what is an overall collective memory?
It's a very technical question for which I have a very long answer that I'm not going to give. But it is exactly as you say, and it's super interesting because it's a split country with the memory on the West and the memory on the East. The memory on the East is heroization, as I call it in the book. We are the heroes. We were those who stopped the Nazis. And the West has culpabilization, which is it's our fault, we made a mess, never again. And basically, I do combine these two memories and to then obtain a single measure for stigma. And the stigma, anyway, despite the fact that a part of the country has heroization, remains quite high. But yes, it's a combination of the two aspects, and this goes back to also looking at the indeed communist legacies, because in a way Germany has both communist legacy and Western legacy, and I find it a super fascinating case. I think the stigmatization worked for a very long time. It's one of those countries where, like, the mainstream right operated a sort of cordon sanitaire, a sort of isolation. These are pariahs. We don't put them in power. We don't want to deal with them. Merkel, I think, was quite much doing that. I conclude here the Trojan horse metaphor. Also, AfD, in my opinion, benefited from the fact that they didn't emerge immediately as an extremist party who wanted to burn migrants in the street. They emerged initially as a party of professors, of almost technocrats. And I think this helped a lot going around the stigma, which is still there anyway. It's not that the stigma disappeared, but I think they could go around by first presenting themselves in a certain way.
If I can, I would rather ask it without a microphone because I'm a bit afraid of it.
Okay.
I was wondering, you were talking about some common populist styles and techniques. I was wondering if there's something as a common populist goal, something that the populists strive for, because I think that it actually, I mean, from what I observe, it's very different for different populist parties and politicians. So, but I guess you know a lot more about it. Anyone? Thank you.
Very briefly, then I will also like to hear from you. No. Excellent question, thanks. I'm not sure I have the good answer to the question. It's a very good question. There is work to be done on this in case you're shopping around for it. No, I believe that one of the main goals, beyond electoral goals, right? So if there are populist movements or party movements, of course, they have an electoral goal at the end of the day. But beyond pure electoral goals, I think that what they all have in common, movements, political actors, populist actors, even populist politicians, is to disrupt. The main and primary goal through which other objectives are achieved down the line is to disrupt the politics of sort of normal politics. You can see this on the left, you can see this on the right, by jumping into a sort of common scene, shaking the tree and see what falls down and what stays, is a good way to attract attention from the public. And of course, to get also attention from the media, because it's a very simple sort of gold on the ground that the media pick up, like there's this new crazy actor in town. And then once the spotlight is on them, then more political goals can come in depending on left or right. But yeah, I think the easy question, or the simple question to your complex, the easy answer to your complex question is to disrupt the politics as usual. And I think they are rather successful in doing that.
If I may, that is like sort of goal towards another goal. But I was wondering, what is, if you take if you take a politician as a person, populist politics, I don't know, yeah, you mentioned tons of them. Is there something they have in common? Because if their goal is not actually to give power to the people, which I think we all can agree that it is not, then is there something more than just wanting the power and wanting some benefits for themselves? What do you think?
I think it becomes also personal when you look at specific figures, but if I can probably maybe generalize a little bit, many of the politicians that can be roughly classified into the populist type, right? I'm simplifying here voluntarily, tend to score high or in at least one dark trait, which is narcissism, which you can discuss. What does a narcissist want? Simply what they want. So it's not really achieving the power because political power is cool, because they can get a financial benefit. That's even secondary. Just being at the center of attention. Disrupting the politic because it's cool, because they can. I'm really simplifying here, but I'm deeply convinced that there is something like that. That there is a performative style that they simply get a kick out of it, right? And it works. Getting a kick out of it and it works. In scientific terms, is the research on legitimacy and sincerity and authenticity. Right? Very often, these type of political actors are seen as more legitimate and sincere, because maybe they don't know a lot about politics, but they really say what they mean. They are genuine, right? And they get a kick out of it. They like what they do. Yeah, they disrupt the politics. Politics is boring. I'm simplifying. But I'm pretty convinced that there is quite a bit of this for some populist actors.
Yeah, I agree, and I think what is with populism, as with some other ideologies, is that it's less clear what they are in favor of than what they are against. So they would probably say that they are in favor of popular sovereignty, that they are in favor of translating the will of the people directly into policy. They would say that they are in favor of referendums, but in the end, what they are really in favor of is disrupting politics as it is practiced, the elites. Political elites, but also economic elites, media elites, cultural elites, and disrupting those elites and basically destroying politics as it is practiced and disrupting it. I think that is what the only goal that we can really discover from them, because it might be the case that there is a bigger goal behind that, and that would say it's the people. But in practice, you don't really see that.
It's full of questions.
Thank you. Thank you for a great talk, and especially to Luca, who I haven't had the pleasure of seeing before, and really breath of fresh air. So really a pleasure. My question is for you with regards to the role of, to the responsibility of academia, and in particular populism scholars, with regards to this media conceptualization of populism, which confounds it with, as you said, with nativism, with nationalism, with authoritarianism. And do you think that there is maybe something that we're doing wrong? I say we because I'm also part of the University of Amsterdam, and have done my fair share of populism research. This way that it is presented, it actually kind of spills over as well. When I'm listening to Matthijs, for example, sort of counting the number of cases in Italy and saying, it was Berlusconi and Forza Italia, and then it was the Movimento 5 Stelle, and then it was now Meloni. The Movimento 5 Stelle, for example, is very different from these right-wing populist sort of organizations. And when I say you, I take you as an example, but we fall into this trap of putting them together, and this thing very easily permeates the media, and clearly there isn't a way to reverse it, and then we have situations where we have very interesting and very progressive parties and movements like Podemos or like Syriza, who take this label of populism, who receive this label of populism, and because of this are discredited. Whereas they shouldn't be, in my opinion. So what is my opinion wrong? And if it's to a certain degree right, what do we do What do we do wrong, and how do we do it right?
I have one thing to say about this, but you for sure have other ideas as well. So I think the problem comes from two sides. It's both the fault of the media and the fault of the academics. The academics tend to not be able to say to the media, sorry, I'm not an expert on these, ask someone else. And they call you and you have to talk about this thing, and, you know, comes out something not very accurate. The other side is also that the media are a bit lazy, and when there is the talk of populism, they need an article on populism. And if there isn't, they make it, and that's it. So combining these two things, I think we created this monstrosity that everything is populism, and we don't even understand what we're talking about. Parties that are completely different, and we want to say nativist, we want to say racist, we want to say radical right, we want to say nationalist, we want to say a lot of things, but for laziness and disorganization and academics' shortcomings, we conflate all in one word. But I am afraid of something, because I do see a lot of colleagues making clear with the media now this thing, more and more. Like, well, you don't want to ask me about populism, you want to ask me about something else, so let's talk about something, throw away that P word. But I am afraid that the logic of the media, the logic through which most media operate, will soon find a replacement, a surrogate drug. When you stop heroin, you need something else, you need a methadone, and then there will be a new populism soon, because I think it's already wearing old. I think we've been talking obsessively of populism for 6 years, and you said you have deja vu every 2 years, saying the same thing to the media, and at a certain point something else will sell. And I think that new thing that sells is death of democracy, in a way. And it sells because also it is partially the result of all these years of populists in power. But and I am a bit afraid that we will hear a lot more about this death of democracy for the next 5 years, and everything will have to inevitably lead to the death of democracy. And there are already at least 10 books out titled How Democracy Dies in Darkness. And honestly, democracy doesn't die. I don't think it dies. I mean, it's rare that you go from a fully democratic to a fully undemocratic regime. It happened in Italy in 22, fine. But normally there is a democratic erosion. There is a process to follow, and populism plays a part in it. I'm just saying that I'm a bit afraid that we will just find a new pet, and it will be something. I don't know, I said democratic death, but it could be something else. And it's not any better, because it will just repeating the same mistake with a new concept, I think.
Yeah, I see your worries. I think the only thing we can really do is be really clear about what we're talking about and what we're comparing with what. So I think when we talk about populism and we mention parties like Podemos, the Five-Star Movement, but also Geert Wilders, Thierry Baudet, that makes sense, but only if you talk about populism, as I said, right? So not if you really want to focus more in depth. And then you should use other concepts. And I think what we should do as academics, the only thing we can do is make that as explicit as possible, also when we talk with or write in or whatever we are in the media, because there these more nuanced messages often get lost in basically the urge and the incentives to publish something that is sexy. Yeah.
Did you say Social Democratic Party of the 60s? No? No, sorry.
Okay. I'm not from the field, so I was thinking about if I should ask the question or not. But it is related to the demand for disruption and the answer, the supply for the disruption. And when the disruption happens, it usually follows with chaos, at least for someone as me from outside of the field. And what happens if that chaos becomes normal? Will there still be a further need for disruption of the chaos that the first disruption created? So, on that, if you can answer.
Yeah, That's a brilliant question. Two elements to answer that. First, what you're referring to is the difficulty also of populist movements when they become institutionalized, right? All of a sudden, they are not so disruptive anymore. They're part of the system. And so there are several examples of populist movements that when they become part of governments, for instance, they tone down the rhetoric because it doesn't work anymore, right? Second part of your answer to your question ties back into what Matthijs, you were saying before about the fact that populism works, especially for some people, not for others. You mentioned your work with Gijs and Bertha on agreeableness. But there is research that also looks at other type of attitudes, and one of those attitudes is relatively newish in the literature, is need for chaos, which we can discuss. But basically, what need for chaos as an attitude implies is that there is a non-negligible part of the population that really likes conflict, political conflict, right? But also sees in destruction of institutions the solution to contemporary problems, like is support to statements such as, if there is a problem in the house, you cannot fix it, you have to tear it down and build it again, right? This is need for chaos, need to disrupt and disrupt. And there is very preliminary evidence that shows that people that are high in need for chaos are more likely to support populist movements, and are also more likely to be affected by aggressive rhetoric, even by non-populist movements. And all this ties into what we were saying before, that maybe there is something underlying all of this, a sort of growing desire in the population to have a more aggressive forms of politics that is expressed via populism by the elites, or some elites, and via this type of attitudes, populist attitudes, but also maybe need for chaos in the population. That's a very good question.
Hi, thank you for the interesting interview. I want to dive more into the rhetoric and a little bit of to the role of us scholars. So what I always find interesting is the role of truth in populist communication. So since it is a lot about the antagonistic worldview of the honest people and the corrupt elites, there's a lot more focus on experiences of the honest people versus actual facts. So now we are all members of a truth-seeking institution, and my question is always a philosophical question that I ask myself: do we speak a different language? And when we have a growing literature on populism and we have growing populism, where's the bridge in that?
The role of honesty and truth. Wow, that's... facts don't matter. Facts don't matter, and that's a fact. But I do believe that framing matters. Framing matters in the sense of the way that populists manage to depict reality resonates with a lot of people because of several reasons. First, it reduces complexity. I don't want a super complex story where there are 100 different variables that interact and then there is the outcome that could be this, but no, I want a clear story. It's their fault. I point a finger at someone, and that's my answer. And I think that that's super convincing in a lot of cases. Donald Trump built a whole presidency on it. Bolsonaro built a whole presidency on it. Line and line and line. And the interview with Federico Finkelstein on this regard is very illuminating because it shows how populism took from fascism the repeated lie as a characteristical trait of their operational way of doing things. But we have really few time left, but do you want to add something on this? I think it's a very important reflection.
Yeah, I think what I find the most scary thing is that we as academics try to find something like the truth, right? And the fact that populists and far-right politicians, what is increasingly the case is that not the things that we find are not believed, but even the fact that it comes from academia already is a reason not to believe it, and that is something I find really, really scary. to end on a very positive
I
note.
also see a kind of correlation between how the populist vision of the world resonates with a sort of cult or religion in which you take the chaos of the universe and you separate through a line. We are here, they're there. You create this cosmology of the world that internally makes a lot of sense, and it has this appeal of, when you have faith in God, you have faith. It doesn't matter the fact. It's not about reality. It's about your faith. And I think populism has a lot of this component. I'm telling you this. The others are saying the other things. Why? Because the media lie, because the opponents are corrupt, and I'm the victim of persecution. And why you have to believe me? Because I'm the leader. I'm the savior. I'm the one bringing you out of this mess. So there is this, I would say, quasi-religious element of populism to take into account.
I know that there are more questions, but I'm also mindful on the clock. I think we have, unfortunately, to end the session here. This was a good way to end the discussion. I'm still going to end with a super tiny question to you. Thanks, Luca. Because we have several students and colleagues in the audience that are writing, have written, or will be writing books, which you have done. So question to you, help us. What would you do differently in 2 words? Now that you sort of can take stock, but about your book. You can take stock of this massive experience that you had. It was amazing. What would you do differently?
I'm talking about an edited volume, so this is not a book I wrote alone. This is a collective effort. Advice number 1, when you work with 30 academics... No, do it. But if the publisher tells you that this is the deadline, to the 32 academics, you tell them that this is the deadline. And then anyway, you tell them that in reality, it's even before than that. This will allow you to be relatively late, but not too late. You will be reasonably late on the schedule so that the publisher doesn't kick you out of the whole enterprise. By the way, Alessandro says this, but he is working on an encyclopedia with 250 entries.
Small ones, not like this.
Yeah, no, come on. That's 250 entries. So, another advice, there is another thing I would like to mention. I tried to have a book kind of gender balanced, let's say. And what I didn't know before was that, so this book is called A Dialogue with Leading Experts, right? So when I contacted men and women, I had really different replies. Men said, of course, I'm an expert, interview me. I know everything, go on. Women were like, I left academia. Who are you? What do you want? Don't know who you are. I'm not an expert, I'm sorry, but come on, you should ask someone else, etc., etc. So I would, if I had to go back, I would ask to men and women, but to way more women, so that in the end, there is a balance. I didn't know this, but next time I will take that into account. Oh yeah, and of course don't write a book. I mean, obviously. I mean, who would ever do that for any possible reason? And it's terrible.
Thanks, Luca.
Thanks,
Luca. I think we can leave it here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you also for...
Thank you for coming.